This heavy rain is interfering with our auspices,
muttered Tarvum Banis over the Vox. The sergeant of the Forge Breakers advanced at the head of a squad of 5 Iron Hand intercessors. To their left, advancing in silence in an almost mechanical pattern of moving from cover to cover, was another intercessor squad of 5, Medusa's Will. They all carried bolt rifles, all blessed and ready to fire.
It is more than just the rain. The enemy is making their presence known,
said Agar Korthal, Primaris Lieutenant, leading the Iron Hands through the ravaged city.
We can't be too far now.
The Iron Hands force had been advancing through the city ruins in a location designated as Sector B-58, in search for a Death Guard sorcerer, known only as the Rotting Head. The darkness of the night and the rain covered their advance, at least to a degree. The Death Guard had devastated Byzantia, a once proud city with countless temples and shrines dedicated to the adoration of the Emperor of mankind. With pestilence, heavy bombardments, and the spread of virulence, had the sons of the Plague Lord destroyed the city and butchered their inhabitants, many of them suffering fates worse than death. Without warning, the air came alive with the buzz of flying bullets and flashes lighting in the distance. Across the street, the windows and openings of the ruined buildings were lit with muzzle flashes that betrayed the cultists' positions as they fired down at the Iron Hands.
Contact!
Warned Tarvum.
Open fire!
Low-caliber projectiles ricocheted off Agar's leading pauldron. He automatically raised his weapon, looking for targets to return fire. His abilities were augmented by his advanced eyesight that traced the many trajectories of bullets flying through the rain. The 2 squads advanced for cover while firing towards the enemy, their bolters roaring in defiance as the first cultists fell. Many bolt rounds hit directly into the flesh of the heretics, blasting heads from shoulders, cutting bodies in 2, or converting them for an instant into a cloud of thick red dust. Other bolts burrowed right through the walls and into the cultists hiding behind them. Across the street, not a single Iron Hand fell in the opening barrage.
Tarvum, target the top of that building on the right,
commanded Agar over the sound of the intensifying battle. The sergeant of the Forge Breakers nodded in affirmation. A moment later, the squad opened fire. An masked cultist covered in robes and wielding a banner fell off the building, his body ruined by the impacts of the bolters. Despite that, more heretics kept popping from multiple spots of the ruined buildings and opening fire. Their losses were mounting, but they seemed to pay no heed. 2 cultists wielding heavy stubbers lined up and opened fire against Medusa's Will. The Astartes were forced to take cover behind the wall they were advancing towards. But one of them fell before they could fully reach the relative safety. Across the street, the cultists let out a cry of triumph upon seeing the fallen Astartes. The traitors' cries were answered with the roaring of bolters that blew them apart. Then suddenly, a terrifying sound that enveloped the entire sector came into a brief existence. For just a second, Tarvum's lenses became dark and flickered while the Vox glitched with distorted sounds. Tarvum was certain the others had felt that interference as well. As the sound of the horn died out, the screams of the cultists took over. As if given a dark signal by the unnatural sound, the dozens of cultists jumped out from their cover and rushed to the Iron Hand's position. Running crazed, with crude weapons raised high, they charged in a frenzy that would make any man go mad at the sight of their wickedness. But not the Space Marines. Their guns kept firing with a terrifying efficiency, as the Iron Hands do.
Hold position,
muttered Agar, as he continued picking targets and identifying potential new threats. Their guns barked continuously as mass reactive rounds pushed through the flesh and bone of the damned cultists. They were being blown apart, but they still kept coming. The encounter was turning out to be so heated that only few noticed that the rain had stopped.
The traitors think us weak if they expect us to falter against them and their tricks. Let them come. We will prove them wrong by crushing them,
said Tarvin. As the first cultist reached Tarvin's squad, he was greeted with a deadly slash of a sharp combat knife. Rounds of controlled bursts from the bolt rifles kept tearing open cultist after cultist, spraying blood and guts over the walls and the street. But for all their efficiency and combat prowess, the two squads and their lieutenant could not hold off all the cultists that were running towards them, and one by one, they all became engaged in close combat. Kogor had been waiting for this opportunity for months now. The chance to take on a servant of the Corpse Emperor. It filled the cultist with an unnatural desire to bury his tainted knife deep in loyalist flesh and share the blessings of Grandfather Nurgle. For who could possibly refuse to be given this most precious of gifts? The Forge Breakers were all consumed by furious fighting. The number of heretics surrounding them kept the whole squad busy. Kogor bided his time and seized his opportunity by carefully approaching the sergeant amongst all the chaos. Tarvum didn't see the blow coming. Kogor managed to hit Tarvum in his arm, and the knife struck deep. The knife had found a weak point in the sergeant's armor. His eyes lit up, and a short-lived smile was drawn in Kogor's face. But he was soon shocked to find that the knife had only scraped the mechanical arm of the Space Marine, with his most calculated attack, wielding his cursed blade. He had found no flesh at all, only cold iron, an artificer bionics. Tarvum grabbed the heretic by the throat and looked into his eyes for a fraction of a second before he snapped his neck. An instant later, Koger's lifeless body slumped to the ground, and he moved no more. Amidst the chaos of battle, Agar Korfal hacked down foe after foe with extreme proficiency. His blessed sword, thick with the traitor's blood, his genetically enhanced body, and his skill made him a killing machine that dealt deadly blows left and right. All Iron Hands in the sector were in the same predicament.
Chaos Abomination in sight. Level 2 threat approaching.
Agar heard the warning in his vox as he wrenched out his sword from a foe. In the briefest of spare moments he had between fighting the swarming cultists, Agar lifted his head to see the creature approaching him. It was less than a few feet away. The Chaos Spawn was mutated beyond reason. It had grasping pseudopods, and vile, dark liquid was drooling out of the thing's mouth. The spawn came closer to the lieutenant, and before engaging, the deformed creature screeched to the heavens. Its terrible cry drowning the sounds of battle all around them. The men of Medusa's will were suddenly fighting next to Agar. The 4 remaining Astartes had moved to support their leader, engaging with the cultists, while the lieutenant fought the abomination in front of them. Close by, the Forge Breakers hacked down foe after foe. The cultists trampled their own wounded as they charged ruthlessly towards the Iron Hands squad. Tarvin had killed hundreds of heretics by this point. He had crushed skulls, pulverized chests, and more. And so his brothers by his side, fighting with all the resolve that the Iron Hands were known for. Some Astartes had wounds by this point, as some cultists managed to find weak spots or find openings to push their crude weapons through. Time became a blur for the surrounded Space Marines. They had battled for many long minutes, or perhaps even a couple of hours. The edge on Tarvin's combat knife began to dull. He had driven the weapon through skulls, crude armor, weapons, flesh, bone, and more. But he kept killing, wondering what kept these cultists coming, despite the heavy losses they were sustaining. The fight with the Chaos Spawn was over. The Blessed Sword once again proved too much for the tainted enemies of Agar Korfal. The lieutenant raised his head after making sure the creature was truly dead. But what he saw gave him no relief.
Poxwalkers to the right!
He informed his men over the Vox.
Purge the Chaos Brothers!
The Iron Hands that were able to take a quick look noticed the new wave of pallid corpses that advanced towards them in a slow but consistent walk. Many of them were clad in rotting rags while flies buzzed around them. Some others were completely naked, with their bellies split open, trailing their intestines behind them as they shambled forth. The fate of the Poxwalkers was truly worse than death. These victims were afflicted with the walking pox, a virulence that keeps the subject conscious while their body is infected to death, making them a walking, agonizing creature that is half alive and half dead, moving only to share the curse with the living things in front of them. As the Poxwalkers approached, the stench became more and more present, and it was a gut-wrenching odor. Bursts of bolter fire greeted the new enemies, exploding them into clouds of flying rotten flesh. But they proved to be disgustingly resilient, as many kept walking despite the terrible wounds they suffered. The cultists kept fighting, but there were less of them now. If it was part of a bigger strategy by the Death Guard, or they simply left because of the unbearable foul stench, the Iron Hands did not know. As Agar looked around him, he watched as a group of cultists were picking apart one of the forge breakers, each of them ramming their weapons into him, probing for weak spots and finding their openings. As they were put down by his brothers, the Poxwalkers had finally made their way to them. And on top of that, at least 2 more Chaos Spawn were spotted, approaching their position. The Poxwalkers seemed to be coming from every direction at once. Then suddenly, gunfire. The helmet of a forge breaker exploded, and the man fell dead. His squad was being targeted by bolter fire, and the impacts made them stumble. Even the cultists were being cut apart by the incoming fire.
Bolter fire! Blade Marines are across the street!
Was heard over the Vox. The 2 pin squads were overwhelmed by enemies, but they kept fighting in close combat and returning fire whenever they could. 2 Plague Marines fell to the accurate bolter fire of the Iron Hands, while a 3rd received a clean shot to the head, but it kept firing back despite having half his helmet and face completely blown away. The fight was bloody, and it was becoming a battle of attrition that would only benefit the Death Guard if it continued. The sorcerer known as the Rotting Head was nowhere to be seen yet, and the encounter was quickly turning against the Iron Hands.
Back! Get back!
Yelled Agar to his fellow Iron Hands as he realized they were being quickly surrounded by the enemy. The Astartes began to retreat whilst still firing and fighting back. Yet some others were still too busy struggling against the horde of Poxwalkers. As they struggled to retreat, something unexpected happened. 7 Blight Lord Terminators from the House of the Rotting Hand teleported behind the Iron Hands, compromising their position and completely encircling them. These were monsters, in the true sense of the word. They were all clad in sickly green armor, marked by heretical signs and symbols. Thick pus dripped from the joints of their armor, their pale skin revealing that they were indeed dead, yet somehow alive by the dark power and gifts of Nurgle. One of the Terminators hurled itself towards Agar, swinging with his massive Bale sword towards the Iron Hand's lieutenant. The blow sliced clean through adamantine and ceramite plate and cut the flesh beneath. It wasn't an upright deadly blow, but it was just enough. The deadly poison embedded in the plague weapon, and now, in the lieutenant's chest, began doing its work immediately. Agar shrieked in pain, but he stood to fight the monsters that were now coming together against them. He raised his blessed sword in defiance. The Space Marines of Medusa's will were being dragged down by countless hands that grasped for their eyes, their throats.
We are surrounded!
Yelled Tarvin over the Vox as he was stuck, struggling against a poxwalker that had managed to grab him. The walking corpse was missing the lower part of its jaw, and its empty eyes stared at him. Eyes with no soul. The Forge Breakers and Medusa's will came together to fight back to back against the unending hordes of enemies that now assailed them.
So my friends, I hope you enjoyed that rather tragic short story that saw this group of Space Marines surrounded by the enemy. This video was recorded using some stuff from my own small collection of Iron Hands and Death Guard, and this episode is an experiment more than anything else. I'm looking forward to reading your feedback on it. I know that many viewers won't necessarily be fans of this particular way of storytelling, but hopefully many others will get to enjoy it, so I'm interested in reading what you have to say in order to get better and better as time goes by. I think one of the most amazing things about Warhammer is that it allows for many ways to tell the stories of this gargantuan and ever-expanding universe. If you watch the videos on the channel, you would know that we push for a heavy focus on narrative here. So it was super fun to be able to put together the scenes and take the photos to try to illustrate a story and set in the grim darkness of the far future. And I can now tell you that the biggest challenge for this one was getting the lighting right. I think it is the most important part of being able to take a good photo or recording of a particular scenario. How you set up the lights can make or break a scene, and I still have a lot to learn in that particular aspect. Hopefully we will be having more and better episodes like this in the future. What you are now seeing on the screen are some of the other minis that I have in my own collection, and those can definitely be put to good use. One of the things I really want to do eventually is bring you guys proper battle reports with a lot of narrative flavor mixed in. Each battle having its own story, every character having a real reason to fight, and so on. I have a couple of ideas already that I think could work well with this format, but in any case we are a couple of months away from seeing that, at least here on the channel, but yeah, those are the plans basically. I have to give a very special thanks to Skrubasauras, who did the narration of this episode. His voice acting is always on point and he's super awesome to work with. Also the awesome patrons and YouTube channel members that support this channel. If you guys want to support what we are doing here, please consider joining our Patreon page. It grants you access to our Discord server, previews of the upcoming content, early access to the full finished videos, and so on. It really helps the channel a lot and everything gets invested right into the channel. So thank you for watching up until this point. See you on the next one, my friends. Cheers.